Now, universities are big things. They're not as big as the universe, by no stretch. But just to think about the universities in Singapore, and their budget, if I'm not mistaken, is on the order of like $1 billion a year. And the Substation's budget, I don't know what it is really, but it's on the order of like $1 million. So it's 1,000 times different. Now 1,000 is kind of big, but it's also, you know, imaginable, right? It's not like 10 million times bigger. Anyhow, so the arts community and the university. The question that we're asking is, why aren't these two communities more entangled? Now, there's been a lot of debate and discussion about the function of the university. More and more we seem to take for granted that the university really has an economic purpose, and thus, you know, I talked about some sums of numbers and budgets. But if you may recall, the university had a somewhat different function a long time ago. And that was much more sort of in touch with the ideas of education, what education meant, rather than just sort of equipping people for a career or enabling the economy by doing research and technology and applied sciences. Now, what's interesting is that there are discussions of the function of the university, and there are also discussions about the function of the arts. But it's very odd that you don't have these two debates sort of, you know, overlapping as, as they should. The arts always has something to do with an education. To be involved in the arts is, in some ways, hey Paul, is to somehow, you know, have an education in the arts, formal or otherwise. Now, when we think about the relationship between the university and the arts community, one thing that we can think about is in terms of audiences. And you would think that at an arts event, let's say at the Substation, for example, you have some kind of performance here in the black box. You would think that it would be a natural place for, let's say, university students to come, whether they're studying English, history, science, or engineering. And in some ways, you have this kind of lament from arts organizers that, oh, we don't seem to be reaching out to these audiences. Now, one way of constructing that story is a story that we've heard a lot, but it's also a very misleading story, that of, let's say, student apathy. We could reverse that or correct that and ask questions instead, you know, what are students interested in? How do they engage in culture? Now, let me introduce our cast today. Our first speaker, this is Charlene Rajendran. Her full bio is in the booklet, so peruse that if you like. But she's a theater practitioner, writer, educator, all those kinds of things. And also, very importantly, maybe, I don't know, a Malaysian. Oh, very important. And she works probably, also at the Nanyang Technological University. The proceedings today will be moderated by Chua Ai-Lin, who's over here. And she teaches history at NUS. Later, we'll have a roundtable of a few university students, and when they come up, I'll introduce them. And then we'll have a break. We'll have a couple more speakers, and so on. Okay, so I'll hand over to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Weng Choy. Thank you very much, Substation, Weng Choy, and Henry for this invitation. I was really honored to be asked because it is the Substation Conference, and more importantly because I'm not an expert on this topic, and certainly not about the things that Weng was talking about earlier. So being invited and then saying yes led me to think about some ideas that are proving useful in my own work. And I hope that the ideas that I bring to the table today are going to be useful to you as well. So I start with a disclaimer. I'm not sure I'm going to address what Weng was alluding to in the beginning. And if you were expecting an expert opinion on the university and the arts community, you might want to either leave now or turn on your earphones or come back later or something. But if you decide to stay, this is what I intend to do over the next 20 or 30 minutes. I'm not able to talk about the links between the university and the arts community in all its manifestations and historical connections. That's way beyond my scope, and I think the scope of this event. But what I've chosen to do is to state the obvious, and then look at some twists and turns that emerge from the obvious. And hopefully this will lead us to contemplate what more we can do in the space of interaction, indifference, overlap, separation, conjuncture, and disjuncture between the arts community and the university. So I have some, well, three actually, obvious statements to make, and then two suggestions for how this can twist and turn. But to start, why state the obvious? If it's obvious, then it doesn't need stating. And in this instance, I'm working on the assumption that sometimes the obvious is neglected, and thus insufficiently questioned and critiqued, so that the obvious becomes a truth that actually gets buried under layers of the less obvious, and we forget the obvious. So from time to time, it's worth going back to the obvious, even if it is to ask if what we think is obvious still really is obvious, and to whom. Also, the obvious is not often associated with the university and the arts community, as these domains are supposed to look beyond the obvious, produce new knowledges, new visions that are not so obvious. The university and the arts should, after all, acquaint us with the unusual, the rare, sometimes obtuse. Leave the media and the politicians to deal with the obvious. In which case, maybe the obvious needs to be reclaimed and re-examined in relation to the abstract, the obscure, the oblique. So my intent today is to play with the obvious and hope that in the process we begin to consider how the university and arts community might reshape their relationship with each other and review potential ideas or areas of expanded interaction. So in stating the obvious, my aim is also to then give it a twist and a turn maybe, and tweak what is obvious with ideas that are maybe not so obvious. If we overlook the obvious just because it's so obvious, then maybe we also deny its power and the opportunity to subvert dominant forces by intervening with a little twist. But before I start with the blatantly obvious in relation to the university and arts community, I think we should note a very obvious fact, that these two entities that are being compared are quite different. The university is a site, I mean the university and the arts community. It's a site, the university, quite often outside the center of the city, except perhaps for an SNU in Singapore. And it's regarded as a location where certain kinds of work, study, research, administration, etc. occur. Points to an institution where groups of people come to work, study, explore, experiment, etc. And as an institution, which I think Paul's going to talk about more, there are borders that define its location, even if nowadays that the borders are increasingly porous because of increased interaction with organizations and institutions outside the university. The university is often located out there in a bit of a forest or a jungle where it creates a little city or a polis of its own. And there is a community that emerges out of it, which is dominated then by this institution. The arts community, however, is a group of people without an institution. It has no permanent site, it certainly has no borders, and we could say the arts community is quite simply a multitude, to use Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's term, which consists of several singularities which share commonalities, but are conscious of their difference and don't intend to dispense with these differences. The arts community inhabits a wide range of spaces and continually relocates itself according to its needs. And that coming together and dispersal lie at the heart of its process of meaning making. So even if the buildings and institutions come and go, sad as that may be, the arts community carries on. What matters is the ongoing flow and the continued interaction across time and space. The more it changes, the better. The more transformative and transgressive, the more alive and dynamic the arts community tends to be. So it often finds itself in the city, but creates something of a jungle or a forest within that city or polis, where a different quality of existence is brought to bear. So one question we want to think about, obviously, is what happens when the arts community no longer generates a jungle in the city, but conforms to the demands of being citizens rather than multitudes or nomadic tribes? Or what happens when the university refuses to locate itself symbolically, metaphorically, out there in the jungle or the forest, and becomes too readily an ordinary part of the city, what then? But I'm not going to go into that. My main point is that we're looking at two rather different entities. It's not the arts community and the academe, or the arts center and the university. It's the university and the arts community. So, why spend a Saturday afternoon in April thinking about their connection? Well, it's obvious. They matter. And they matter to each other. How so? And what's the twist? Well, my first point about the university and the arts community is that they're both obsessed with the same basic question: what it means to be human. The arts community gives varied expression to this question using a wide range of forms, mediums of interaction and connection. It's continually challenging notions of where being human begins and ends. The university researches, interrogates, produces knowledges about what is human, creates formalized opportunities for instruction and discussion about what it means to be human, consolidating ideas, truths, facts, information, theories about the wide range of implications for being human, but opening up new questions about what being human entails, what accounts for being human. So both are deeply curious about this question and generate any number of ways for validating the need to find out even more about this human life. It would seem pretty obvious. Now, the way in which they approach this question may be quite different, such as when an accounting or engineering department looks at what is human, they won't employ the same processes akin to a literature sociology department. Compared to an arts community, the business school might appear very distant in its engagement with what is human, yet maybe not so anymore. But nonetheless, whether it's to produce new cyber technologies or create fresh visions, artistic, imaginative, creative, it's the human being that is at the heart of these complex and consuming enterprises. So, with philosophy departments becoming scarce in the university, that question of what it means to be human is being moved away from a very particular location, the philosophy department, across the different science, humanities, and arts faculties. You may say the question's not being asked at all. I'd suggest that pronouncements are being made all the time about what it means to be human, even if it's in the ways that the academe is being evaluated and assessed, the kinds of research and inquiry that are funded and supported in favor of others, sometimes in ways that are quite dehumanizing. And I dare say that's happening in the arts industry as well. What works? Or what gets bought for a festival? What loses money? What's refused the permit to perform? There's often a blatant disregard for what it means to be human when machines take over. And I don't just mean inanimate ones. If we are the desiring machines that philosophers Deleuze and Guattari say that we are, constantly producing desire that leads to the production of machines which manufacture further products of desire on an eternal chain of desiring, then how do we short-circuit this process to return to or advance beyond what we understand as, and as, more importantly, practice as being human? Will we get to become the bodies without organs that we want to be? Another D&G notion, which suggests that we need to deterritorialize and then re-territorialize if we are to resist the dominant forces that impose very restrictive, inhuman codes upon us. But enough of that. Let's get back to the obvious. My second point is that the university and the arts community, in their interest about what makes us human, are also deeply engaged in difference and disagreement. The work that is being done to articulate what is human is lodged between the different ways in which this could be done. There is less fascination with sameness than with deviations and variations that emerge from commonality, such that theories evolve to say something new, something different, as do new artworks, and the place for difference is critical. To homogenize would be to put us all out of business, and there would be nothing more to say or do about being human. And as a result of this, emphasis is placed on how we disagree as much as there is a desire to acknowledge where we concur. It is the dialogic rather than the dialectic that gains priority, and by this I mean that, as Richard Sennett points out in his work on cooperation in a book called Together, the discussion need not end in resolution, but can go in diverse directions without having to be logically linked. The cooperation and collaboration that emerges comes out of close listening and attending.
in order to make sense of different and disagreeing perspectives, which then produce something new. And in this way, the conversation with strangers, those whose difference matters, generates possibilities that otherwise wouldn't surface. Hence, the complexity of life is primary rather than secondary. The skill of dialogic empathy, a term Sennett uses as well, is developed to reflect on what else we need to say and do, rather than stay within the limits of what we already say and do, aesthetically, intellectually, creatively, theoretically, so forth. The political will to allow for divergent views and communicate deeply with people who are radically unlike each other, whether in the name of interdisciplinarity, interculturality, internationally, or whatever, means we value the skill of conversing across borders, whatever those boundaries are perceived to be. And we do so without having to erase the demarcations. Particularly as, in today's context, this includes connecting the human with the more or less human, the cyborg, the android, the vampire, the zombie. If we are all warm bodies, then can we not be so in more humane spaces? And do the arts community and university need to lead the way in cultivating these sites, to save us from superficial and fear-inducing visions that simply propel us back to our cocoons of reductive and purist visions? In an age of global uncertainty that Zygmunt Bauman writes about in his book Collateral Damage, the point is to deal with the fragility and vulnerability through the art of dialogue, and so resist allocating the status of failure to whoever is cast aside in the overwhelming flows of the market and consumer fantasy. One more obvious point before I move to the twists and turns. The university and the arts community engage in understanding and articulating the contemporary, looking into the now to see the past and future within each moment and beyond it as a critical dimension of being human. Whether the contemporary is labeled modern, postmodern, traditional, classical, popular, digital, and so forth, the point is that being human entails being present. And being present requires a now in which to do so. Philosopher Giorgio Agamben defines the contemporary person as one who is, quote, more capable than others of perceiving the obscurity of the present and grasping their own time, end of quote. This means, to use his image, being able to look into the beam of darkness and apprehend it, less blinded by the lights of the century, and so the contemporary manages to get a glimpse of the shadows in those lights. Beautiful poetic language. In Agamben's term, the contemporary also has a relationship with the present that is mediated by the past, choosing to reckon with the indices and signatures of the archaic and the modern, that articulates an affinity between the old and the new. Able to thus speak to places and spaces of displacement and uncertainty, aware of the broken vertebrae, he calls it, of human existence that is fractured, proposing ways of becoming connected and disconnected, creative and destructive, inclusive and exclusive. Part of the ongoing tension, isn't it, of dealing with multiplicities, difference, disagreement, disjuncture, despair. In this regard, the university and the arts community participate, if not collaborate, in the process of shaping, reshaping, articulating, interrogating, and visioning the contemporary human being, the contemporary human becoming. And this is crucial work that needs to be done in an evolutionary process of becoming meaningful and being purposeful. I'd say the arts community is more adept at this, embraces this challenge much more readily than the university because of its flexibility, porousness, and somewhat nomadic capacity. Yet, the rigor and exactitude of the university when it does catch on or catch up is to look closely at what this means and to make it more cohesive, if not more accessible even. And they're both needed in the task of making contemporary human life comprehensible, imaginable, and perhaps even livable. So turning to the twist, having made some obvious statements, blatantly I hope, I want to now try and tease out what else we might consider in relation to these three main ideas about the question of being human, dealing with difference, and investigating the contemporary. The arts community and the university need each other, they are already linked up, but how else? In fact, I dare say that in the 21st century, this is a critical relationship that could impact significantly on how we develop as a species. We've seen what happens when we allow economics to rule. We've experienced the overwhelming power of science and technology, such that the need for a more balanced approach is evident before we blast off into the future or we are blasted by imbalanced powers. To return to the metaphor of the jungle and the city, or the forest and the polis, jungles are being threatened with extinction and destruction all the time. Cities are becoming increasingly uninhabitable due to overcrowding, pollution, crime rates, etc. And this may be something that we need to bear in mind for the university and the arts community. If the university located out in the jungles is meant to provide a certain distance for critical reflection, then it should not get too entangled with the business of the city and thus lose a sense of independence, something that's increasingly hard to do with the corporatization of the tertiary education industry. And if the city is meant to provide a hub or a marketplace, a polis where people come and go and get right into the thick of things, then it needs to ensure that it manages to do this without creating too many hazards, where there's respect and integrity, where there's an experience and awareness of the jungle as well. So, in developing the discourses on what it means to be human, there are two areas of work that I think the university and arts community could collaborate on more consciously to generate more epistemological options, wider artistic imaginings, links with the political climate, environmental terrain in which we continue to live and breathe. And they are simply in the arenas of ethics and spirituality. Here's why. Why ethics? The question of what is responsible, what gives dignity, how we cultivate respect, embrace difference, deliver justice, etc. Not in a high-handed, judgmental way that both the arts community and the university have veered away from, thankfully, but in a considered and critical manner, conscious of the implications of violence, abuse, injustice, and indifference that are the outcome of a poverty of ethics, particularly when a consumer-oriented market is geared towards profit alone, and thus validates and sanctions many unethical practices in the name of efficiency and success. Here, the university and the arts community have an urgent task, as we are increasingly plagued by pressures to be unethical, self-centered, narcissistic, complacent, biased, ignorant, arrogant, irresponsible, etc. And what it means to be human, both in the university and arts community, relates closely to a deep and convincing ethics, not one that we necessarily all agree on, but nonetheless is fundamental to our sense of value and purpose, and the kind of dialogue that we conduct. The term ethics comes from the Greek word ethos, which roughly means character, and what it means to act with a sense of grounded and principled character is becoming less pronounced. Yet, we seek integrity, respect, kindness, as if they were so rare in the environments we inhabit. We seek strong characters who inspire and awaken our sense of right and wrong, good and bad. What constitutes good character is of course varied, and as a theatre person it's something that fascinates me all the time. That we've become enticed by bland and boring characters because they conform to a prescribed notion of stardom or celebrity fame. And the really interesting, complex, conflicting and dynamic aspects of character are largely purged from our consciousness. It's interesting to me because this complicates things. And here is where we need to reassemble the ethical, borrowing from Bruno Latour's reassembling of the social, to revise how vocabularies come to have currency and solidity, and look again at the associations and connections that are performative rather than just ostensive, again, drawing from Latour's terminology. What is it that makes kindness kindness? It's not necessarily obvious, nor should it be. Science tends to deal with the physical and has gone to incredible detail about what it knows and how it can do this. And in comparison, when we look at what informs the ethical, particularly in relation to rights and responsibilities, we seem somewhat impoverished in terms of vocabularies, technologies, epistemologies, and even aesthetic frameworks. Never mind the issue of funding. The ethical has become less important compared to the physical, less desirable as a focus for study or imagining even. And yet in an age of global uncertainty, this issue of collateral damage that Bauman refers to, which he identifies as being the result of an indifference to the underclass, who are seen as responsible for their own misfortune, even when it's clearly the outcome of faulty systems, is an ethical one. In a liquid modern society, many more fall prey to the calamities of anxiety and fear, guilt and shame, with little or no recourse to being empowered through dialogue or reform. How can we be responsible for the other? Something the philosopher Manuel Levinas wrote about at length in relation to faith and respect. We tend to neglect in the name of autonomy and individuality, we tend to neglect faith and respect, failing to provide security and space for multiplicity to thrive. Even if we celebrate diversity, we cheer on mix and fusion in the name of tourism, or is it market opportunity? The university and arts community are well primed to address issues of ethics because we have a history of looking at what is human, dealing with difference, and engaging the contemporary, and thus working with the dilemmas, the conflicts, the tensions of these difficult questions, these complicated situations, these confusing circumstances. It cannot be left to the religious and political powers, as their motivation in resolving ethical issues is quite different. They want a single answer and they want it now, not later. Ethics cannot be left to the purview of ministries of education and legal authorities, who tend to swerve ideas in a particular direction, and understandably so. So if the university and arts community can work on a range of collaborative endeavors that produce multiple perspectives on what it means to deal ethically with our world, we could perhaps begin to develop a dialogic ethics that's not weighed down by one right answer or one version of the good. Taking on issues that span culture and heritage to biotechnologies and stem cell research. A dialogical ethics could push us to be more respectful of difference and not just tolerant. How and where to draw the line is going to become more and more complex, and we cannot rely on state-led narratives alone to tell us what to do. Neither should we abandon all sense of guidelines and principles. But to do this means dialogue that is reverent, rigorous, and risky. And I think the arts community and the university are suited to doing this. Okay, so why spirituality? Not religion, but spirituality. It used to be that the university and arts community were closely tied to practices of religion, and thus deeply embedded in the practices of spirituality. But with the tide of modernity that brought science and secularism to a fore, departments of theology are few and far between, and religious schools tend to operate independently of the university. Artists may or may not be religious, but they seldom are seen as primarily located within institutions of religion, and thankfully so in many respects. We need to allow for more neutral spaces where knowledge and truth can be developed without having to serve reductive and narrowed religious frameworks. Artists and academics need to be free to articulate their visions without having to subscribe to a particular religious identity or serve the dictates of a limited creed. But in keeping these domains apart, have we thrown the baby out with the bathwater? Much has been said about the rise of religiosity in the age of global uncertainty. And there's now no debate about whether religion will die out with modernity. It clearly will not. And people who are in the arts community and university are not oblivious to the role of religion in everyday life and the impact of belief systems in knowledge making and art making. There is regard and reverence as much as there is cynicism and skepticism. But is there understanding, insight, and respect that comes from interest, awareness, and engagement? Well, what is this thing called spirituality? Even the invincible Wikipedia, you can look this up, admits that there's no definitive definition for spirituality. And we all turn to Wikipedia at some point or another, even if we don't expect it to provide the definitive. So without trying to provide any definitive definition of spirituality, let's just say it's about the sacred, that which relates